Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to day 3. It's been very engaging sessions, and I want to thank each and every one of us once again for our very engaging topics, discussions. We have learned a whole lot, very fruitful. The issue of identity, reclaiming identity, is a continuous struggle. But one thing we have observed in this conference is that there's awareness and there's willingness to keep talking, keep discussing until we arrive at where we are going to. Today, we are going to listen to another keynote by Thomas Skinner. So we enjoy.
Thank you, Gloria, and thank you everybody for attending today. I suppose on the subject of all the speaking and discussion that's happening, I can tend to waffle, and as Aideen said yesterday, speak for Ireland. So I'm going to stick to my notes to try and keep this on track, because there's quite a lot that I'd like to cover in this. So thank you very much, Gloria. Thank you especially to Dr. Toki Loughton-Brown for giving me this opportunity to speak and to give this presentation, and also to all the members of the ACHS organising committee, the volunteers, all the speakers and attendants for together creating what has been just a extremely rich and enjoyable conference. So this presentation comes from a slightly different perspective, that of the Irish planning system, and as such I'll throughout the talk briefly explain some of the characteristic features of how planning is organised and carried out in this country for the benefit of our international guests, mostly. But the planning system is a favourite topic in Irish media, usually bemoaning its faults in some way or talking about some new scandal that's taken place. So I do apologise to anyone from Ireland here who might be sick to death about hearing about it, but here we are. However, the planning is also an extremely important lens to explore a number of issues relevant to critical heritage studies, and especially in relation to the theme of custodianship, the longevity and the sustainability of having to balance heritage and landscape protection measures with a market-driven development context, as well as a changing climate. The question of multivocality and diversity, whose voices are heard and recognized in a participative planning system where opportunities for engagement are framed by powerful discourses, and how local communities can be empowered to shape the environment in which they live. So I hope this presentation can add to these discussions. And I'll just say that while I focus on Ireland in this talk, I thought that I would welcome any comments from our international guests on how this compares to planning systems around the world, many of which face common issues, of course they do, but find novel and context-specific solutions for them. So other speakers have introduced themselves a bit. I thought I would as well. I was born in Dublin. I live in County Leitrim, which I thought I'd point out, as a lot of the guests don't know where that is, and quite a few Irish don't believe that anyone lives there. But it is a very beautiful part of the country, and I'd recommend people visit it if they get the chance. And next year's conference is quite a distance away from where I live as well, 2 years. So I work in the private sector as a planning consultant in the Mullingar office of the Planning Partnership, where I'm involved in a range of projects including housing, retail, energy, tourism, education developments and heritage. But this presentation is based on the research project that I carried out in early 2023 as part of a 2 years Masters in Regional Urban Planning at University College Dublin, supervised by Dr. Arthur Parkinson, who's in attendance today, and who will be presenting tomorrow on the historic urban landscape approach in Ireland. Before becoming a planner, I had a background in archaeology and museums and heritage engagement. For example, I was a program associate with the Centre for International Heritage activities in the Netherlands, through which I co-organized and guided a series of heritage field schools and seminars on Robben Island, South Africa, in the summer of 2016. Before that, I studied Asian studies at Leiden University, where I was at that point that I developed an interest in this field of critical heritage studies and joined the ACHS and even before that, I studied archaeology in Glasgow. So, protected views, vistas, and scenic routes feature consistently in Ireland's development plans and the planning process, generally as part of visual impact and landscape character assessments, and in the context of development management. The aim of this talk is to identify some of the characteristics of view protection as an authorized discourse, an expert-driven and institutional arrangement in which the ability to identify views, determine their significance, and control decision-making is influenced by top-down principles of value and knowledge, and that these fail to recognize the full diversity of perspectives associated with the visual landscape, as is encouraged by the European Landscape Convention's recognition of landscape as an area perceived by people. View protection is carried out in a number of different contexts in Ireland, and the protection mechanisms differ from one planning authority to another, but this project focuses on view protection in County Galway with the town of Athenry, which is around 23 kilometers east of Galway City, as the case study location. So views are distinct from that which is generally visible or perceived. It's the delineation and organization of space through anchors, landmarks, boundaries, conceptual frameworks of value and significance, and communicative acts. Discussions on the purpose of views are wide-ranging in the literature and include, amongst other things, a focus on the qualities of setting and intervisibility in relation to archaeological monuments, aesthetic values associated with the picturesque tradition, the beauty, the sublimity, the romanticism of an ideal pictorial landscape, and the importance of imageability, aesthetics, and legibility in urban design, townscape analysis, and placemaking, which are all key themes in planning. The political economic function of views for national identity formation, place branding, and their exploitation through tourism has also received increased attention. In tandem with this is recognition of the staged and scenographic situation of viewing through the contribution of theatre, photography, and film literature, and their related links to place branding and the tourist economy by way of scenescapes, as was referred by Boya Guo in their excellent talk on Monday about the adaptive use of authenticity in China. In the context of view protection, views are further discussed and defined through their association with conservation and development management practices, which are justified in relation to certain understandings of authenticity and threat. This is the case in Ireland, where view protection is discussed in relation to visual impact and landscape character, the impact of wind farms, solar farms, or tall buildings on a skyline. Now, it might seem obvious to say that seeing is the primary sense that through which views are encountered, and view protection has traditionally prioritized the visual sense. The obstruction of sight has been one of the primary threats associated with views, demonstrated, for example, by the development control guidance of the London View Management Framework, which is an extract of which is shown on the right here. Tom Brigden has written extensively on the intellectual construction of the protected view and the colonial processes by which ideologies of the picturesque and frameworks of management have spread across the globe. To quote from The Protected Vista, such systems often rely on an understanding of cities and sites as a series of fixed visual compositions to be perceived at eye level from static viewpoints and determined by scientific vectors, planes, and coordinates. In this sense, one could view the phenomenon of the protected view as a natural extension of Western oculocentrism, a typical example of the privileging of the visual over other sensual perceptions of cities, and a demonstration of the use of the vision in patterns of control. Unquote. An objective and detached perspective supports the categorization of identifiable and measurable information gathered through visual observation and that fits within established frames of knowledge and as such rendered legitimate, authentic, or useful for related practices, such as planning. The close links between views and a positivist presumption of the objectivity of information gathered through vision indicates a dependence on the hegemonic idea of common sense. Surely everybody can view a view the same way. Surely everybody can recognize its value. But belief and truth are highly dependent on the perspective and context of the observer, and views have been recognized in literature as being culturally formed and highly manufactured experiences, packaged and presented to recipients that have different levels of agency in the visual encounter. Post-colonialism has been a recurring theme throughout this conference, and it's no less the same in relation to views and how views are encountered. In this regard, Finola O'Kane, current professor of architecture at University College Dublin, has demonstrated that Ireland was at the core of the development of aesthetic values associated with the picturesque tradition during the 18th century, even before the discourse had been fully developed in England. This was directly associated with presenting Ireland and the visual qualities of its landscapes as an attractive destination for tourists, often from the elite. While much of this has been associated with the carefully designed landscape gardens of the domains in Ireland and of the landed gentry, it had deeper influences in shaping the cultural understanding of how landscapes, scenic landscapes, are viewed. And I'll give an example of this while introducing the case study location, Athenry, just to the right of Galway there. From a planning perspective, Athenry is identified as a town with great significant strategic potential, an area that can accommodate future population growth while attracting further foreign direct investment and the development of indigenous industries and businesses as part of an economic corridor connecting the town with Oranmore on Galway Bay. While the town has grown significantly over the years, its population is currently just over 4,600 people. It's a place that is largely defined by its medieval heritage, the physical presence of which has influenced the spatial patterns of growth, the movement networks, the sense of place, and the tourist economy. Almost 1.5 kilometers of the original 14th century wall that once extended for over 2.5 kilometers in length survives to this day as a protected archaeological monument. And a great number of historic structures remain in the historic urban landscape that the wall encloses. These include St. Mary's Church, which today hosts the Athenry Heritage Centre, the 16th, 17th century North Gate, which is the sole remaining entrance through the walls into the historic centre, and which was renovated in 2019. The 13th century Priory Church of St. Peter and St. Paul, which was converted into a handball alley and enjoyed much use during between the 1920s and 1970s, and remains it was a much discussed part of the sports heritage of the town during the walking interviews. And the Norman Castle, which survives from the mid-13th century, restored in 2005 and is today managed by the Office of Public Works as a museum. So as I was saying, the historic landscape of Athenry has formed an important part of the identity and sense of place, which has long been admired for its picturesque and historic character and association with tourism. In 1889, an issue of the Tomb Herald, a local newspaper, says, "Athenry presents a curious, quaint and picturesque appearance, a place that should often be visited and better known to tourists and travellers." Half a century earlier, one British visitor to the town describes it in 1843. Athenry, once the capital of this province, contains many remnants of the olden times. Seen from a distance, it has an imposing effect from the extent of the old city walls, which, with its flanking towers and moat, is wonderfully perfect. There is besides a venerable abbey, of which the pictorial effect has been greatly marred by the barbarous piety of some. Still, it is a fine massive building, and viewed in combination with the castle and the parish church, contributes materially to the solemn effect of the distant view. And this detached perspective, favoured by the picturesque ideal, comes across strongly by the visitor, and they go on to say how little they want to actually enter the pictorial scene, drawing largely on the worst aspects of the colonial gaze. They say, "For distant your view of Athenry must be, to impress your imagination with those deep and reverential feelings which its historical recollections call up. Within the walls, all is misery and meanness, squalor and penury. The place of a king, Athenry, for such is its etymological designation, is a heap of wretched cabins where supreme dirt holds its court, and the king of beggars might most appropriately keep his royal state amongst those who paddle in the streets. So, yeah, very, very much a detached perspective, focusing on the aesthetic vision from a distance. So, this project recognizes views as heritage and aligns them with a broader critical turn in heritage studies, one aspect of which has been a shift in the attention away from physical, monumental, outstanding examples of an authentic past towards the recognition that heritage is multivocal and contextual. Ideas of pastness, ideas of authenticity are manufactured narratives that reflect the values of the present and the goal orientations of the future. And I'm going to quote Rodney Harrison in his 2015 paper, Beyond Natural and Cultural Heritage Towards an Ontological Politics of Heritage in the Age of the Anthropocene, where he says, dialogical models of heritage push us to consider the relationship between heritage and other social, political, and environmental issues, as they do not insist on seeing these various fields as separate, arguing instead that they are interconnected in fundamental and complex ways. In particular, they foreground issues of sustainability and the role of cultural heritage conservation as part of a broader environmental agenda. End quote. Conceptualizing views in this way aligns them with debates between materialist and constructivist approaches to heritage, the extent that meaning, value, and authenticity are intrinsic to the materiality of the visual landscape, or constructed and maintained through dialogue, the communicative acts that define and shape the world. In the words of Foucault, they systematically form the object of which they speak. Because views are not self-evidential. They cannot speak for themselves, and they're not simple. Views are what we say they are, the result of a dialectic process in which truth and knowledge are constructed and communicated in the language used in formal and informal communicative acts. However, although a plurality of perspectives may exist in what heritage is and can be, power relations determine what is considered part of the canon of heritage, and the ability to communicate and be heard and recognized within this canon is not held equally by all. Now I'll just draw attention briefly to some of the parallels between view protection and the concept of authorized heritage discourse, which is well understood, I'm sure, by everyone in the audience, but for the purposes I'll do it very briefly. Views and view protection, like the authorized heritage discourse, can be readily explored as a Western hegemonic discourse characterized by a focus on the aesthetic and the monumentality of sites, the belief that heritage value is inherent to the visual landscape, to the materiality of the visual landscape, that authenticity is made evident through scientific inquiry and technical ability, that value is universally recognized, and that certain expert actors, institutions, modes of knowledge and practices are privileged and legitimized. Further research in the field of planning by John Pendlebury of Newcastle University and by Arthur Parkinson, Mark Scott, and Declan Redmond of University College Dublin, amongst others as well, have shown that authorized heritage discourses are also pluralistic and contested within different contexts. In the words of Pendlebury, Scott, et al., they are internationally shaped but nationally articulated. Parkinson, Scott, and Redmond have shown that authorized heritage discourses are often entangled within sub-discourses and narratives that can be utilized by communities of expert actors and authorizing institutions in response to different contextual challenges, social inclusion policies, competing priorities between the public and private sector, and other authorized discourses outside of a heritage context, such as housing, economic development, tourism, or climate change. And as a final point, this project engages with the topic of affect and emotion, which has also come up repeatedly in many of the talks at this conference so far. Because meaning making is discursive, but discourses can be influenced by and expressed through emotion. The visual landscape is a powerful medium to evoke effective responses and emotions, demonstrated, for example, by the language used to attract tourists to the romantic and evocative Wild Atlantic Way. And while the concept is relatively well discussed in heritage studies, it has only recently been drawn upon in planning literature, but it doesn't offer an important perspective for engaging with issues of representation, identity formation, and meaningful public participation. So in the case of Ireland, view protection emerges through the domain of planning and development management, the processes of deciding whether to grant or refuse planning permission for development. The planning system is also actively involved in matters relating to heritage and landscape management at a range of scales. Characteristically, the Irish planning system is hierarchical and conformative, insofar as development must conform to the relevant framework of national, regional, and local plans and guidelines as set out by law, as shown in this chart. And the planning system is also highly litigious, with a growing body of national and European case law that plays an important role in planning decisions. Designated planning authorities, such as Galway City Council or Galway County Council, control the location, amount, and type of development by making decisions on planning applications within their functional area. The planning system helps to decide what areas need to be protected or enhanced, assesses the suitability of proposed development, and strategically plans for the future, in which heritage conservation and landscape management are some of the many layered matters that are considered. At the same time, development is, for the most part, dominated and driven by the needs of the market, and in practice, developers and planning authorities enjoy a high amount of discretion in the interpretation of policies to facilitate development and maintain a highly politicized neoliberal system. As an additional point, in Ireland, all plans go through a public consultation period where individuals and groups are invited to submit their views and make suggestions. Any member of the public can also make a written submission on a planning application to express their support or any concerns they might have of its impact. Ireland also provides, uniquely compared to many other planning systems, for both first and third party rights of appeal against planning decisions, where any person applying for planning permission or who made a written submission or observation on a planning application can appeal its decision to An Bord Pleanála, the independent national planning appeals board. So planning exists not only as a development management system, but as a forum through which relationships, conflicts, and debates can play out between different actors and stakeholders. And because of this, it's a highly appropriate field in which to examine communicative power. Planning has been accused of being a largely technocratic and expert-led discipline built upon a universalist and utilitarian discourse of common good and the functional rationalism of the scientific method. Planning provides a framework for ensuring consistency in management practice and confidence for certain stakeholders, built upon, in the words of Frank Fisher, an unswerving belief in the power of the rational mind's ability to take control of the natural and social world. However, planning has transformed in light of deontological, social justice, and sustainability debates, and the idea of a unitary common good has been questioned in an increasingly diverse and multicultural society, and one that has a greater awareness of the political economy in which planning occurs. Views are also inextricably connected to processes of perception and value formation in a landscape context. And landscape management, as I said, is a key function of the planning system. There's been a well-recognized shift in focus from normative approaches that define and manage the landscape as a resource and commodity to the recognition that landscape is neither singular nor easily divisible, but is multifunctional, operates as a complex system of systems, and has qualities that differ based on how it's perceived from one person or discipline to another. These and other characteristics of landscape are recognized by the Council of Europe's European Landscape Convention, as adopted in 2000, which defines landscape as an area as perceived by people whose character is the result of the action and interaction of natural and or human factors, taking into account the particular value assigned to them by the interested parties and the population concerned. The Council of Europe have also highlighted the significant interactions between democracy, human rights, and sustainable development in the landscape. The 2011 Evora Declaration states that landscape democracy and social territorial cohesion and citizens' participation are fundamental and related themes. The right to the landscape should be considered a human right of the 21st century, and that landscape multifunctionality has to be planned and adequately managed. It cannot be taken for granted. as has been brought up in a number of the talks at this conference, including Desna's wonderful keynote presentation yesterday, which resonated so strongly with the issues and themes that I'm exploring in this project, an ecosystems approach has been favored in recent landscape literature to understand the relationship between different yet interconnected systems, especially in relation to matters of sustainability debates. The concepts of more than human encounter, entanglement, and nature culture have drawn attention to the biocultural nature of landscape, in which landscape is not understood as being composed of distinct and separable natural and cultural elements, but as systems of diverse phenomena and socio-ecological relationships and the cultural services that they provide. In addition, the study of historic urban landscapes offers an opportunity to explore views as being multivocal and multiscalar, the power relations involved in governance and public participation, as is recognized in UNESCO in the 2011 recommendation on the historic urban landscape that says civic engagement tools should involve a diverse cross-section of stakeholders and empower them to identify key values, develop visions that reflect their diversity, set goals and agree on actions to safeguard their heritage and promote sustainable development. And this has also been a recurring theme throughout this conference, the importance of empowering stakeholders to be custodians, to give them the power to identify their own values, their own vision, and to set their own frames of reference by which heritage is identified and safeguarded. Ireland has ratified the European Landscape Convention and introduced legislation to support it, and the National Landscape Strategy, which presents the mechanism of landscape character assessment as a key tool. I can speak about that more later if there's time. So the aim of this research project was to contribute to these debates surrounding the role of heritage, public participation, and authorised heritage discourses in Irish planning, and to present hopefully a more holistic and inclusive approach to how view protection is carried out than currently exists. Now, while I have stressed that the Irish planning system is highly discretionary in terms of how decisions are made in individual planning applications, it is also fundamentally plan-led. Decisions are made and importantly justified with reference to the contents of statutory plans. I just wanted to make a quick observation from the last few days that many of the talks during this conference have considered the role of theory in heritage studies, in critical heritage studies, and many more on the challenges of practice, of how to achieve a more meaningful approach to stakeholder engagement. But in between there's policy, and policies really, they translate theory into intent, and policies justify and validate the actions that are carried out. So, as an observation, I do think that critical heritage studies should not easily dismiss the power of policy that it can hold, and depending on the system in which you operate, the opportunities that exist for people to input and shape the wording of such policies. Because of this, it was the communicative power of planning texts, the policies that they contain, that was explored in this project. The ways that they frame an agenda, guide processes of engagement, and identify the structures in which information is considered relevant, valid, and useful. A key objective of this research was therefore to evaluate whether or not the experiences, uses, and values of protected views, as described in authorized discourses, align with the characteristics and effects of local viewers. And in light of this research aim, the information that was sought consisted of detailed qualitative descriptions of stakeholder engagement with views. A range of different methods were considered: sedentary interviews, focus groups, photo elucidation, photo voice surveys, but in the end, walking interviews were identified as the most appropriate methodology for collecting in situ information on the interaction and engagement between people and place. I'll briefly quote Andrew McClelland, who formerly of Maynooth University and currently at University of Manchester, who utilised walking interviews to elicit participants' engagement in the military heritage site of Ebrington in Derry, Londonderry. And he states that places, whether considered historic or otherwise, are more often simply defined by their physical form and tangible attributes. They also derive their meanings and significance from relationships that people develop with and through them over time, intimately linked to the activities, experiences, and practices undertaken within the walking interview method provides a readily adaptable means of assessing people's everyday lives in the historic environment, sensitive to how individuals and communities differently experience and construct their understanding of place. Rather than being passively led, participants can actively shape the walking interview process, with researchers adopting a hands-off policy, preferring to listen, observe, and partake in informal two-way conversations. The walking interview is an ethnographic approach to assessing citizen experience while in place, and one of a number of public participatory methods readily adaptable to conservation practice. End quote. So I carried out walking interviews in the case study location in Athenry. In terms of the analysis, it was an iterative process of coding and interpretive memo writing to evaluate the two, in which I found Norman Fairclough's perspectives to be particularly useful in terms of discourse analysis, analysing the interdiscursive relations between discourse and other elements of the social process, such as representation or identity formation, and driven, importantly, as he says, by the overarching intention to identify social wrongs in the discursive aspects and possible ways of righting and mitigating them. So I'll just give a little context for how view protection developed in Ireland and explore some of the path dependency of certain ideas, institutions and actors that formed over time. So an interest in the link between development control and the preservation of aesthetic and public amenities was expressed in different early legislation in 1929 and 1934, but ultimately it was ineffective in its implementation. There was very little interest in plan-led development in Ireland at that time, which was by all means economically stagnant up until the 1960s. But major changes did come about in the Local Government Planning and Development Act of 1963, which was passed following Ireland's first programme for economic expansion between 1958 and 1963, and marked a turning point in the economic and political history of the country. In this context, the role of planning was to support the economic development of the country, including the redevelopment of built-up areas, facilitating foreign and private sector investment, and the improvement of amenities. The 1963 Act introduced updated legislation for view protection that the planning authorities must secure the preservation of any view or prospect, and may identify areas of special amenity by reason of their natural beauty or scenic or other amenities, and to restrict or prevent development in such an area. On Forras Forbartha, the National Institute for Physical Planning and Construction Research was established in 1964 with assistance from the United Nations Development Programme. Its overall aim was to provide research and training in planning and development of urban and rural areas, and they played an active role in creating the institutional and professional identity of planning in Ireland, defining the concepts, the practices and the technical skills of professionals, and raising public awareness and acceptance of planning expertise. One example of this was an institution established in 1971, the Conservation and Amenity Advisory Service, the purpose of which was to provide specialist assistance and advice to local authorities on the discharge of their conservation and amenity development responsibilities under the 1963 Act. With regard to view identification and protection, one of the key documents produced by An Forras Forbartha was Volume 2 of Planning and Amenity, Recreation and Tourism, which was undertaken as part of a wider seminar series on controlled development in the landscape. The text emerged from the same context of the 1963 Act in relation to the role of planning to support economic development and improve amenities in the landscape. And it presents a duty and obligation to protect views and areas of prime beauty from damaging and discordant development, alongside the need to exploit them in the interests of economic and social development for their tourism value. A concept of views and visitation was introduced in this text that continues to play an important role in view protection, that scenic landscapes should not only be preserved with regard to their authentic and unspoiled quality, but also improved through development, I quote, so that the natural beauty is enhanced by the modern amenities and facilities which must be provided, end quote. That is to say that scenic landscapes they don't just exist, but they're seen to be used, as evidenced by, amongst other things, pony trekking routes, walking routes, picnic areas and intensively used recreation areas. On first Furber also established the use of a checklist approach to view designation and categorization in the form of a landscape amenity checklist form. With no mention of local communities being consulted, instead the checklist presents a very formulaic approach to be filled in by practitioners whose expertise on the criteria, which include siting, obtrusiveness, backdrop framing, landscape patterns, was framed in a language of presumed objectivity and impartiality. This checklist approach was aligned and supported with a view-based typology of value, which established a scenic hierarchy ranging from sublime, highly scenic to rural landscape settings, and in this way draws upon a picturesque ideas of aesthetic beauty and sublimity to assess the significance of the landscape. The current legal framework for the planning system in Ireland is the Planning and Development Act 2000, as amended, and supported by a series of regulations that underpin the Act. They're amended regularly, and they put legislative change into effect and update guidance to planning authorities. These documents define the scope, the management processes, and the goal orientation of planning and of view protection as the preservation of the character of the landscape, including the preservation of views and prospects, and the amenities of places and features of natural beauty or interest. The legislation identifies the obligation of local authorities, which includes the restriction of development that can interfere with the character of a landscape or a view, but this is hedged by acknowledgement that such decisions are highly discretionary and based on whether, in the opinion of the planning authority, the proper planning and sustainable development of the area requires it. The National Development Plan and the National Planning Framework set out the Irish Government's national planning and infrastructure vision and the means by which it will be carried out. And below the national level, Ireland's 3 regional assemblies also have a range of powers and input in relation to regional spatial planning and economic development. And there's several key aspects of national and regional policy that I just want to highlight. First is the recognised power of heritage to privilege and shape national and local identities, value frameworks, and create a sense of stewardship or custodianship. This is expressed in the ability of places to promote social cohesion, as well as the need to increase awareness of heritage value and to facilitate what they say is the appropriate and sensitive use of heritage assets. Second is an investment focus towards tourism growth, which comes out strongly in all 3 documents, framed in terms of the positive co-benefits that can arise from such investment, in which it is a priority to provide the type and quality of experience that visitors are seeking, with the state's heritage portfolio identified as representing a significant tourism asset. For instance, the aesthetic values of the northern and western region, as includes County Galway, are framed in their quality as a physical environment of outstanding beauty, which is host to some of Europe's most spectacular and unique landscapes and wildest coastlines. Framed in this way, the region's landscapes are considered in terms of their potential to be a product, to be protected as key assets which will continue to drive visitor numbers upwards over the coming decades through branding and marketing efforts like the Wild Atlantic Way. The National Planning Framework provides this very interesting and useful diagram, they call it the landscape wheel, to illustrate its approach to landscape management, one half of which deals entirely with the perceptual and aesthetic understanding of landscape, which includes sight, but also memories, associations, preferences, and other modes of sensory engagement and cultural engagement. However, no details are provided in the planning framework to indicate how such intangible aspects of landscape quality are to be identified and adequately integrated into landscape management. Although on reference, the diagram does appear to have been derived from an approach to landscape character assessment by Christine Tudor of Natural England, who in their text draws attention to cultural and social factors that shape people's engagement with landscapes, including a sense of time depth, folklore, and mnemonic association. Tudor recognizes that the sourcing and obtaining of information related to cultural associations of landscape can be difficult and time-consuming for practitioners, but also it is expected that the local communities would be actively involved in commissioning, contributing, or undertaking assessments in the landscapes. Stakeholder engagement and involvement can provide valuable information, she says, to help inform and understand perceptual factors that go beyond aesthetic beauty, regarding, for example, a sense of security, tranquility, vibrancy, movement, natural, artificial, and other related aspects. Local authorities use development plans as their main policy document to set out the overall strategy and the specific objectives for the proper planning and sustainable development of their functional area. So the Galway County Development Plan 2022 to 2028 applies for the case study area. As with the national and regional levels, there's just a few aspects of policy that I want to briefly highlight. The concept of placemaking is presented as a priority for the county, as a holistic approach to the planning, design, management and use of our shared environment to improve the quality of people's lives. And this recognises not just aesthetic qualities, but considers a combination of all the social, environmental and economic characteristics and opportunities that are specific to a place. According to the plan, placemaking looks at both the tangible and intangible characteristics of place identity, including the distinctive spirit and atmosphere of a place, and visual connections with landmark features, which in turn place obligations on stakeholders engaging in planning and development to adopt a broader and holistic perspective, to understand the characteristics of their site, and to consider the area beyond the red line boundary of a development. By comparison, within the development plan, view protection is presented almost entirely within the realm of development management. This is in opposition to the very constructive and participatory language adopted in relation to placemaking, as I just described. The purpose of view protection is instead to mitigate against the threat of development that might hinder or obstruct views, and to balance preservation against the need to develop key infrastructure to meet the strategic aims of the plans. It's not presented in a constructive or participatory fashion. The landscape character assessment for the county is included within the plan, and this sets out an assessment of landscape character types and units and identifies protected views. It was prepared by the Conservation and Amenity Advisory Service, which was created under First Forberher back in the 1970s, and continues to this day to input on local authorities, and they were an active expert in creating this document. The instrumental purpose of which is to assist with the identification of appropriate locations for development by way of specialized and professional practice that describes, maps and classifies landscapes objectively, taking account of the inherent value and importance of individual landscape elements. The LCA provides quite a detailed description of its rationale, its intended users, its methodology, and a glossary of terms, including definitions of relevant concepts, as shown here. I won't read them all out. On the one hand, the landscape character assessment presents the concept of landscape in broad terms as being a multi-layered and constantly changing system, formed by the multi-generational engagement between people and place, and taking special note of the intangible cultural heritage elements that inform such engagements. And in this way, the overarching principles of the landscape character assessment align with the understanding of landscape presented in the European Landscape Convention, and are inclusive of the diverse characteristics shown in the landscape wheel, as referred previously. However, those initial principles contrast with the methodology by which landscape character and protected views are identified in this assessment, which adopts a technical, rational and objective tone and expresses the intention to align view protection with the scientific robustness of other planning and conservation practice, such as environmental assessment. So while the LCA does recognize the intangible aspects of views, their natural beauty, the discourse of this text presents such quality as being exempt from the practice of view identification and protection, because such characteristics are not scientifically verifiable through technical practice and measurable evidence. This has implications for how value is identified and recorded, by whom, and also how such information is considered as being precise and reliable enough to be considered valid for decision making. And in this way, it establishes a regime of truth in which a bedrock principle of rationality and objectivity serves a very instrumentalist purpose, not to open up view designation for critique or construction with stakeholders, but to justify the values, institutions, and practices of the authorized discourse. Protected views are presented in the form of a tabulated list with data on the precise rotation, orientation, angle, and location of a viewpoint, and supported by maps and abstract symbols. And also included is a gazetteer of individual protected sites with further information on their significance, which is slightly more qualitative, but still remains highly structured format in terms of the type and language and content that is included. And in this way, this medium serves to frame the discourse of view protection from a very detached, top-down, highly stylized perspective, one that's well suited for using in combination with development management, but provides little sense of the experiential, emotional, historical, or interpretive qualities of views. So view protection is reduced, therefore, to a technical and managerial matter, generally focused on matters of where, what, and how much, rather than why and who were involved, and in doing so it ignores the constructiveness that is being sought through public participation. So there's a map of scenic views, which are another aspect of view protection that I don't have time to go into in this presentation, and then the map of protected views throughout the county. So the landscape character assessment presents three principal sources of measurable evidence that were used to identify views to be protected. The first, use, relates to observable patterns of consistent behavior, such as a roadside lay-by or the repeated presence of visitors. The second, development, relates to observable examples of development that serve as evidence for the presence of a valued landscape experience, which again features parking as a major indicator, as well as signposts that already identify the place as a scenic route. A view is a view because a signpost in the landscape says it's a view already. It identifies the presence of such signposts or parking areas as having the official recognition and resource allocation that indicates them as being a public priority. The third is an element of national recognition. The extent that some views are more highly valued through references made to them in media, including literature, photography, and locations used in film, or used for the advertising and promotion of locations. Now, there's some indication of intangible cultural associations of views given here, but neither the gazetteer nor any other part of the assessment actually describes this significance and in the ways that they might have informed view selection. Instead, visitation and tourism and their supporting infrastructure comes across strongly as the principal use value, development, and national recognition drawn upon by the discourse for the purpose of identifying views. The input of local stakeholders is not mentioned as a source, other than at the very end and directly in connection with tourism. Nor is there any mention of urbanism, placemaking, or townscape, which, for all purposes, otherwise serves as a highly constrained and formulaic approach to identifying views. So I'll just take this moment to recall the checklist and typology-based approach used in the 1970s, as discussed earlier. And it drew upon ideas of aesthetic beauty and sublimity to assess the significance of the scenic landscape. And this idea of natural beauty was directly kind of rebutted in the current landscape character association as not being robust enough, scientific enough, or measurable evidence. Instead, the landscape character assessment draws upon a hegemonic discourse founded on ideas of objective universal value and the branding potential of views. And this is shown in the repeated use of a hierarchy of view significance, at the top of which is national, being views that are frequently used in media to represent and summarize an essential quality that is Irish. Regional, which are views that are often used in media as symbols for a wider area. County level views, which give a sense of stereotype, the stereotypical character of an area. And local, which does indicate the significance of intangible cultural associations of views, of the views of local communities, but unfortunately has not been aligned with any kind of method of view identification that can provide that information and integrate it and recognize it within the system. So to move to the case study of Athenry again, this is the objective in the local area plan, which is just another statutory plan just below the level of a county development plan. And this can be seen to focus on the formal and physical features of the visual landscape rather than any sense of the socio-cultural aspects. And in this way, protected views exist and alongside, but also in opposition to the broader visual landscape. They're based on the concept that there must be something that makes a certain view distinct and separable, not only in terms of value, but spatially, through reference to the scene constructed by focal points and associated important features. 19 protected views are identified in the town. The purple triangles that are shown surrounding the historic core. Many of which are oriented towards the historic town walls, but also include views of the Dominican Priory and views of Athenry Castle as well. And walking interviews took place with local participants in the vicinity of these protected views, but in an unstructured format. They were free to choose the direction of the walking interview, the duration, though they didn't last longer than 20 minutes in most cases. And the content, though it was a semi-structured one in which I had prompts prepared in case the conversation kind of drifted off. So the discourse of the authorized discourse of views presents certain practices as being valid. The objective identification of views by expert-led assessment, the visitation practices of tourists, the recreational uses of amenity facilities and sites, and furthermore presents the hegemonic value of such sites as being readily understood by the general public. But during the walking interviews in Athenry, participants expressed different levels of tolerance to the institutions and practices involved in view management, closely related to a range of opinions on the broader benefits and threats associated with public participation and local engagement. While some expressed their support for technocratic practice on the basis that experts are those that can objectively identify and assess what is important and remove that assessment from any kind of interference, others expressed resentment and frustration with attempts to engage with the community, especially in terms of how meaningful and effective such engagement is, in the sense that of lip service, that decisions had already been made and that practitioners had only gone in to tick a box to say that they had engaged with the local community without anything meaningful coming out of that engagement. So on the one hand, limitations to public participation were seen as detracting from a deliberative understanding of view value and as fostering a contempt towards professional practice. But on the other hand, such limits are presented as being a necessary part of the planning system from a functionalist perspective, insofar as they prevent public engagement from being overly relativistic or manipulated in terms of the processes and the outputs. And this reflects planning literature in a lot of ways, which has recognized that a large element of transitioning to a sustainable future is the building of partnerships through substantive participation, of getting buy-in from local communities, of fostering a sense of inclusion, mutual benefit, and stewardship. And this was expressed strongly by local participants who highlighted that collaboration is a process that needs to adopt a longue durée approach, not come in for a quick survey, but to engage and re-engage meaningfully, that visiting experts might not identify or understand all dimensions of a place, but that they should be open to critique and surprise by local custodians of knowledge, the living archive as referred by Aideen Barry yesterday. When describing the character of views, many participants did focus on material features and formal elements such as sense of framing or symmetry, directed towards individual identifiable features that anchor the view and orient the viewer's engagement with the environment. And I love this statement at the bottom right, the idea that the view is lovely, is spectacular, as long as you intentionally ignore one part of it. Uh, it's out of shot. It was a playground on a busily trafficked road. While most references to view value were framed through reference to the town's medieval character, opinions on this value were not universally shared as being positive, but instead depended on, amongst other things, bodily, socio-cultural, and environmental factors, including colour, litter, traffic, noise, age, ability, historic awareness, and the duration of residency in a town, all of which affect the engagement with the visual landscape. Participants indicated view value was also not just visual, but that emotion plays a large role in their experience. The interrelationship between the physical landscape, environmental quality, and negative externalities, such as noise and litter. And these were expressed with a language in relation to ideas of tranquility, peace, safety, disruption, ruination, vitality, beauty, and disappointment. This element of the view has been excluded as being too subjective by the authorized discourse. And this is a form of very polite exclusion of emotion compared to the kind of acceptable form of emotion and subjective experience by the tourist when they come to visit the wildness of the romantic wildness of the wild Atlantic Way. And similarly, references were made to the multi-layered systems that are entangled with views, including references to elements that are not tied to the present visible landscape, but are drawn upon past narratives or future potential existence value. Conceptualizing views in this way provides a lens to consider the impacts of very diverse short and long-term, narrow and broad-scale systemic challenges that can impact the visual landscape. Not just short-term shocks to the system like development, but also climate change, biodiversity loss, and longer-term processes of land use change. As such, view protection, as expressed by participants, does need to broaden its scope to consider all these aspects of resiliency in the landscape and different processes of change. The participant refers to a bee orchid here, and I just thought I'd bring up the flower here. It's absolutely beautiful. It wasn't there when I visited, but it's an extraordinary plant. The petals resemble a bee, and the scent actually it emanates is that of a female bee. So it attracts amorous male bees to sit on it and pollinate. It's wonderful. So to summarize, what the interviews revealed is that people create their own orderly aesthetic environment out of everyday lives through a highly synergistic process, one that draws upon ideas of memory, legibility, and emotional state. And in this way, the distinction between view and setting, tangible, intangible, self-evident, and constructed becomes blurred. Conceptualizing views in this way provides a lens to consider the impact of different apologies. There is a need, therefore, to move beyond the traditional focus of tangible and visible characteristics of views, and instead draw upon a more socio-ecological systemic perspective that explores the multiple material and non-material services, benefits, and values provided by them. This is a holistic approach that would require putting ecosystem health and benefit and the process of public participation at its first and foremost above ideas of preservation, conservation of the picturesque and scenic. Building upon the Florence Convention, Ireland should make views less exclusive and instead draw upon models that seek to balance the political, economic use value of the landscape, expert-led decision-making as it exists in development management, but also include subjective multivocal expressions of heritage value through dialogue. And this circular approach to the management of views as commons could be highly appropriate in this regard. This diagram by Jean-David Gerber and Gerald Hess, they write about the importance of landscape as a holistic common good that recognizes the different stakeholders and motivations that exist, but builds upon, and this is the key point, continuous dialogue between use value, intrinsic value, and including subjective non-utility existence value. Rather than concentrating solely on the impact of development on the visual perception of the landscape, or focusing on the enhancement of spectacular key views for limited economic benefit. Protected views should instead exist as evidence of a multivocal, diverse and value-laden process of consultation and collaboration. That is what views can be, evidence of process, not of the product. Key to this is placing greater emphasis on the qualitative and interpretive aspects of views, on the multiple benefits and services derived by them, including biographical, educational, interpretive and other cultural services. This would be an inversion of how views have traditionally been understood and managed, and would have important implications, understanding how change is understood in relation to view protection, how threat and endangerment are discussed, and how intervention and management is justified. It would be naive to think that walking into views eliminate the power relations and discursive processes of discourse, but they were a very effective methodology that shifted the focus from the end result towards the process as being more inclusive and in accordance with social sustainability principles. In this regard, the application of the Heritage Council's historic landscape characterization in Ireland best practice guide would be of great benefit. It doesn't actually get involved in view identification or protection at the moment. But in this process, public participation is repeated at multiple stages, including defining the rationale of why views or heritage are being protected, identifying and describing what elements are significant by public participants, and continuous reassessment and monitoring. I do want to say that I work in private practice, not in the public sector, and most of the clients at my company would probably be screaming at me at this stage, why on earth would we want to introduce even more constraints into what is already an overcomplicated and highly discretionary planning system, and make it even less consistent. But I do believe very firmly that that views and heritage more broadly offers an opportunity for development, not a constraint, and that changing an approach to view protection would allow developers to understand the potential impact of the proposals at a very early stage, enable early consultation and mitigation through design, and in such a way save considerable time in the planning application and appeals process. Having this information available could give developers greater clarity and confidence in their investments, and provide local authorities with an evidence base on which to make informed decisions of the common good, by precisely knowing whose commons, whose betterment, the impact of the development and landscape change is being balanced against. Thank you. I have one final observation I just want to make. If I know we're running a little bit late, so I'll make it very quickly. Just on foot of this participant's statement about the finite and non-renewable resource of the visual landscape, that views are actually disappearing in Ireland, or in Galway at least. In 2009, there are 122 views protected in the county, and repeated again in 2015. But as of 2022, that's reduced to only 52 views. All the others have just disappeared from a statutory sense. They no longer exist. They're no longer protected. So it just seems like an interesting observation in terms of the debates on the sustainability of governance practices. How sustainable are protection mechanisms if they can simply be removed through a policy shift? So I have one slide of further reading if anyone's interested on some of the topics. Thank you.
I'm sure we have questions to ask and comments to make. Okay?
Thank you so much for that. I was just wondering, have you found any good examples where both time and funding has been put into mind mapping, collecting these interviews? Because it takes a long time to really embed yourself, find the people, get a good broad approach. So have you got some good examples? Thank you.
Absolutely. Not in the context of views, but in the context of Athenry. The community is actively involved in other planning processes of exactly that. There was a very effective Athenry mind mapping project focusing on the medieval heritage created by school children in the town and with the help of Galway County Council, and it's wonderful. I can send you a link to it afterwards. But yes, the recognition of the value is there from a heritage point of view, but the alignment of that with protection mechanisms is missing. It's recognizing that value as being enough and valid evidence in a development context. Is that connection is lacking. But thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I just wondering, because I came from South Korea, which is post-colonial country out of Japanese colonial period, because I know Irish also is like kind of colonial history. Is there any attempt for national, regional, local planning practice include like this kind of contested element of history into like a consideration when it comes to like real practice? Because I can see that the last slide, heritage site is drastically reduced. So is there any attempt to include this contested element of history?
It's a very, very interesting question, and it reflects the roundtable discussion yesterday by Eugene Ju, who was discussing exactly that. Yeah, to what degree is history informing the heritage process as well, and translating that into practice and management. But no, to my knowledge, there's no kind of explicit reference to policies directed towards post-colonial matters. Not necessarily, but it's a very interesting. I'll look into it more. It's a very good point, certainly. Thank you.
Thank you for a very good and brilliant presentation. I am Professor Basi Igri Okon, the Director of Research, University of Calabar, Nigeria. Your work has now explained to me why some hotel rooms are more expensive than others, and why some seats in the aircrafts are more expensive. Thank you for this presentation on views. But as it has to do with culture, particularly here in Ireland, it is my humble opinion that if you had more examples of the cultural sites here and how the views enhance or affect them, it will add value to your work. Your work is brilliant, and I say congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, and I'll just add that I wasn't able to do it justice in this. View protection in the sense of designated views is just one of many layers of visual impact assessment that exists in the country, and that includes the idea of setting in relation to an archaeological monument or protected architectural heritage as well. So this idea of and it applies also to entire townscapes in the form of architectural conservation areas. So there are many layers to visual protection. This project did just focus on protected views, but I fully agree. Yeah, thank you for that, for those comments.
Okay, thank you very much. Lunchtime, we reconvene at 1:30 for the sessions. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.